Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townshend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townshend, and this is the show where we learn about observability and SRE 1 or 2 weeks at a time. Today, I have on the show Harinder Seera, who is the head of observability at PEXA, and we're talking today about cloud cost, how to monitor it, how to manage it, what to look out for. So welcome here, Harinder. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
Harinder and I met actually in person a couple of years back, at least once, maybe more than once. So we met at WAPA in Melbourne, which is the workshop on performance and reliability, back when I was in the performance engineering world. So just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your role? What do you do? And how did you get there?
As you mentioned, I'm head of observability at PEXA, so I look after observability side of things at PEXA, setting up standards. How do we look at observability? What do we do? How do we standardize observability? Plus, I also look at resilience. So I'm trying to set up a capability from cradle to grave. Resilience is as part of process, as part of applications, and also starting to now venture into FinOps side of things at PEXA. So I've done it previously at other places, but now we're starting, think it's time for us to look at FinOps capability and set that thing up and start looking at our cloud cost, look at managing that. Before that, just like yourself, I was performance engineer / tester. I probably wouldn't say I was purely performance engineer. And I wanted to get out of or branch out from performance engineering and learn new things. That's why I moved into observability.
Speaking of FinOps and cloud cost, at the end of last year, I went to AWS reInvent in Vegas. It was my first time. Crazy experience. But the single most common theme across all of the booths was cloud cost, managing it, monitoring it, making sense of it, reducing cost. Every vendor was trying to say that they could save you from cloud cost. So I guess my first sort of question is, why is cloud cost such a prevalent topic right now?
What I will say is this is probably was in a making, and COVID-19 basically made a perfect storm of why we've got this cloud cost. We're looking at it. I'm a AWS person, so I don't have much experience in Google Cloud or Azure side of things. AWS, for example, in 2016 had one service, that's SQS, I believe. Just imagine how much was the cost, or even as financial person or myself looking at finance, I've only got one service to look at. Currently, in 2023, there are more than 200 services. You've got all these different pricing dimensions. That means you're looking at I/O pricing, you're looking at compute. So you've got all these different dimensions and you really don't know what exactly you're looking at the cost. It's a bit challenging. But what has happened is now you've got more data points. Like in performance engineering, we look at having more data points helps us understand the patterns. 2016, how many companies would have migrated to cloud? Probably a handful. But as COVID came along, suddenly everybody, people lost foot traffic in stores. So everybody wanted, hey, we're losing our sales. We probably need to go to cloud. So they started migrating or started spinning up services in the cloud. Suddenly you've got all these companies in cloud. They didn't even think about how to architect the system. So let's create some service and start, selling products. So you've got that happening. And suddenly they started finding after 1 year, hey, our cost suddenly is increasing. Right? You've got that side of things that are happening. And then you've got multi-cloud that's coming in. People saying, hey, we want to go into multi-cloud. Now you've got cost of having 2 different clouds running. Right? Then you've got data that's moving around. End of last year, you started hearing, or at least what I'm reading in the news, it's inflation's starting to kick in different parts of the world, which means companies are starting to look at how they can keep their revenue, same, and what are the different ways they can look at optimizing their cost. So one of the areas they look at is cloud cost. And you're starting to hear a lot of people saying, hey, how do we reduce that? Also, a couple other things that I noticed is that probably explains why. I normally don't go to in-person conferences, but having it, virtual gave me an opportunity to come and speak. So now imagine you've got all these other companies, other people who can't go to in-person conferences and speak about their experience, can do it virtually. So you're starting to hear all these voices coming in saying, hey, we've migrated, we've got this cost. So that also helps move that discussion along, and you can start hearing people talking about this.
I mean, that's really interesting. So you've got more companies using cloud. You've also have more companies talking about what they're doing and their experience with the cloud because of the rise of virtual communication and virtual conferences and the state of the economy. There's a lot of stuff going on. Clearly, companies are implementing their services in the cloud in a non-optimal way. There's obviously anti-patterns going out there. You already sort of covered the whole idea of trying to lift and shift your on-premise like solutions and put them in the cloud, and they're not optimized for the cloud. So that makes a lot of sense that it costs a lot. What other sort of anti-patterns are you aware of that companies, organizations out there are doing, which is causing their bills to be so high?
Other ones that I've noticed is what you call as no data retention policies pattern they use. This is basically, for example, everybody's moving to cloud. They're starting to generate all this data, massive data. They're storing, let's say, in S3 storage, and there's no retention policy set up. So saying after 90 days, we need to delete, archive this data, move to a different tier. So you suddenly start seeing the storage cost going up. So that's one anti-pattern that I see. Another one that I see is standstill architecture. So what I mean by standstill is once you move into cloud, you've gone with one architecture. This is the architecture we will be using. And you don't really look at what's happening in the industry in terms of cloud providers. They come up with new services, optimized, whether it's performance, cost, and you're not taking advantage of that. You still just continue using the same architecture, which might be just using EC2. What about going Kubernetes? What about using Lambda function and using arcane resources? I still see people using A3 or what you call EC2 instances, or all instances which have been there for the last 5-6 years, right? Whereas they've come up with a new one. They've come up with the Graviton ones. So if you've got that standstill architecture, doesn't move. Then other ones that I see patterns is you leave the lights on kind of thing. This is like, cloud, the meter is running. It doesn't stop. It's just like at home, we've got, electricity. There's a meter that keeps on running. So if you keep the lights on, end of the month, you'll be charged for what you've basically been using. In my sense, if I'm not in a room, I'll turn off that light. But the anti-patterns that I'm seeing is people don't think that way. They it's in cents and dollars. They don't think about that cents and dollars adds up end of the month, end of the year.
So to alleviate that, are you talking about things like when we're not using an environment, or let's spin up environments on demand. Let's scale up as we need in production and other environments as well. Utilizing the dynamic nature of cloud resources rather than just saying we have a static environment and it has all the resources all the time. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. It's similar to I give example of lights. When you go into a room, that's probably when you want to turn on the light. When you leave the room, you turn off the light. You don't want the light to continue, be on. So it's same thing. It's when you don't need the infrastructure, probably scale it down. Right? That's the whole point of cloud, elasticity. It gives you that capability to scale out or in, depending on your demand. But if you just don't use that, other ones that I had noticed is not using infrastructure or as a code, automating, basically. And this is my experience quite a bit when I was dealing with cloud, is people spin up manually the resources, and then they don't know which resource they spin up. So, for example, you might spin up EC2, but with that, you've got S3, you've got ELB, you've got elastic IP addresses that you've assigned to all these different resources out there, and you might delete one, but not others. So using an automated infrastructure as a code for deploying your resources is probably, I see it happening, but it's still people still use, manual way of doing things.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I'm guilty of that in my own little playing around. I just do stuff manually and like, what are all these weird resources doing? I've left these orphaned ELBs and things lying around and I have to go and clean them all up.
Oh, I'm sure we'll cover that topic. One of the things I do in my own personal lab is I've got this budget alert, $0 budget alert set up. So if it goes above that, I know I'm not using it. If it goes above zero, I get an email saying, hey, you've got $1 spent. I now need to know, all right, I need to go and look at it in my account, what's using it, what I'm spending. But yeah, we'll probably talk. A couple others anti-patterns that I see is people are building apps for everything, or basically apps that will be used across different, let's say, cloud provider. For example, you're using Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a big, K8 is a big word now. Basically, it's portable across different cloud providers. You can move across, but do you really need it? So that adds new layer of complexity costing on top of your spend. If you don't need it, why do you really want to be spending time and effort and cost in designing your applications? Why not use the, let's say, Lambda function to do the work? Same thing.
Yeah, the whole thing about multi-cloud, the argument for it for me is dubious at best. Unless your organization has a business context where you must not have any downtime, and even then, how for the cost, seriously, how much value are you going to get of duplicating the same service in multiple cloud environments? I don't see the value proposition personally. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Even I don't think, but yeah, I can see some companies, they want to have it. But personally, yeah, I'm of the same boat. Why? Because, for example, AWS got multiple AZs in same region. Now, if it needs to be some really catastrophic thing to happen that all AZs go down. But how many people even think that way? There's there is an opportunity to train, educate people around these concepts. I think it's probably we might not be doing the good work in explaining these concepts to others.
Makes me think of there's a video that circulates the internet which talks about the size of the universe, and it starts with I don't know, an atom or something. It goes to the planet, and it zooms out and out and out and out and out to just see, and then that kind of thing reminds me of the probability of outages, and then and the way of explaining it to executives and that kind of thing. So I don't know. When we caught up just before, a week or so ago, you were talking about that organizations don't necessarily take into account the extra thought and effort required for security when they move to the cloud. I've been thinking a bit about that, and I do wonder, the fear of security in the cloud, is it warranted? Because I've been reading Lean Enterprise, I actually just finished it, and it talks about that unless you're an organization, you must be putting a lot of effort in if the security measures that you have on-prem are anywhere near the level of security that, say, Amazon can put together or Google can put together. But I understand that you are transmitting stuff over the internet. So do you think it's warranted, this extra effort for security?
It is warranted. Now, my rationale is basically what I was mentioning, automating things versus manually creating. So how many cases out there, for example, S3 buckets have been left open to public to access it, right? Where you've got private data? Probably you're not going to have that in on-prem. Users like myself, who doesn't need to have access to production and on-prem, has got access in cloud, where I might just go and create a resource S3 to put in my documents or whatever. Now, there are those things that you need to take into account. I remember when we caught up with the conference, Volpa conference, remember we were talking about Spectre and Meltdown, which is related into the memory security vulnerabilities. Now, if you're sharing the infrastructure with other companies, organizations, there is a possibility of leaking that data across. Now, how many of us even look at that side of security? It's a different thing. But there are different challenges that you have when I look at it. Some can be just a manual, negligence in side of things. So I do think security is probably there are different things you need to focus in terms of security in the cloud.
Okay, at the start of the interview, you mentioned the term FinOps, also a very popular buzzword at the moment. I saw that a lot at reInvent as well. What is FinOps? Is it the world of managing cost on the cloud, or is it something more? Well, what is it?
It is. It's basically a cultural practice, just like DevOps. DevOps is a cultural practice that we bring devs and operations and the way you do things. It's same thing, but not about cloud costs, managing cloud costs, but it's bringing the teams different ownership into one place, and then you start looking at finance cost. And for example, you've got your finance person, engineering person, you've got everybody in there who are taking ownership of their cloud usage. Right? So it's that cultural way of team to manage the cloud cost, basically. That's what FinOps is.
I learned something new. I didn't know that. I just thought FinOps was monitoring cloud cost. I didn't. It makes sense though. It's like DevOps. It's a cultural thing. It's we are a team. We create a bunch and manage a bunch of resources. Let's think about how much they cost in the organization and how we can manage that and make that more efficient. I like that.
Yeah, and I mean, so you've got finance people. They're interested in cost side of things. You don't want them every month get a big bill shock. But they're not. They might be technical or non-technical in a sense. They might not know why that increase in bill. So you need the engineering teams to help them out. Say, hey, well, because we were running this job, that's what caused the increase. We want to see that. So you want to have that responsible ownership, understanding of your cloud cost usage.
I know your background is mostly in AWS, and I'm kind of curious about how you monitor cost and around that. So obviously AWS provide you a way to look at your cost and how much things are costing. Is that sufficient, or do you find yourself also using external or third-party tools to supplement that?
It depends. Over the years, I have used third-party tools to help me with different extracting different value, different information, making sense. But it will depend on the company. For example, if I'm just starting out, I'll probably use AWS out of the box, Cost Explorer, bill, look at the bill, AWS bill. That gives me enough information to go and figure out what's going on, what's happening side of things. But yes, let's say, for example, our good old topic, multi-cloud. Each cloud vendor might not have access to the other cloud vendor provider information. So you might want to use tools like Cloudability as one of the third-party tools to help you basically get that information. Right? But it all depends on the context, what exactly I'm trying to do, what exactly information I'm trying to get and extract value out of that data. I could even end up using Excel, good old Excel, to give me the answers for my questions. Right? But it all depends on the context. It means when it comes to AWS itself, they got quite a lot of tools already built in. For example, I already mentioned Cost Explorer. You've got billing. They've got cost anomaly detection now. So if there is, they use machine learning to alert if you got a sudden spike in cost. Then you've got cloud intelligence dashboards. That's more tailored towards FinOps side of things. So you've got executive dashboards, kudos. Then you've got your technical advisory. I forgot the name. So they've got all these different dashboards which you can use and leverage for your cloud cost analysis.
Thinking about monitoring cloud costs, do you find that AWS provides you everything you need, the right level of breakdown, so that you can attribute costs to different teams or different components, and whatever level of detail you need to break down to?
That's a good question. Out of the box, AWS doesn't. There are certain levels AWS does. For example, account level, you can have it, the breakdown. So if you set up your resource correctly, you can get the breakdown by account. But when it comes to team businesses, AWS doesn't know your business, doesn't know your teams. They can't give you that information. But what they can is if you use what you call tagging strategy. then AWS gives you the capability to break it down further. So for example, I can have a tag as part of my resource when I'm creating a resource, having a tag saying cost center. Cost center could be, let's say, performance engineering. So now when you're using, let's say, your cost explorer tool, there's an option of tag. So you can say, give me all the costs associated to performance cost center. Now you can have that breakdown. So you can use that tagging strategy to help you out, or the cloud provider can help you out further break it down. But it's the responsibility is on the customer. Otherwise you'll just get a generic high level. This is what you spend in the account, and this is how much each resource costed.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. So it's part of the good practice of any organization in the cloud to tag their resources, so you can add the right level of detail to be able to break the cost down. We were talking a week ago though about what if you've got a service which multiple teams use and you want to break their service down, and how difficult that can be. And there was a open observability talks episode where they we're talking about different use cases for distributed tracing, and one of them was that. So you could have any traffic for your particular service could have a tag in the header which gets passed through, and then you can attribute how much a particular resource is being used by which service. So I thought it was quite interesting.
That's something which FinOps, if you go to their website, they do talk about unit economy, mapping your cost to the business. So how much you're spending per, let's say, transaction, or per customer or function kind of thing. So if you can do that at that level, but how many companies do get it to that point?
I would say you're talking 0.1% of organizations have probably achieved that. It's one of those things we talk about. Oh yeah, it's just easy, just distribute tracing and get all your financial stuff. And it's that's really challenging in a proper complex organization, and not just a startup who's just began a week ago and has one service.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can achieve at least 80 or 90% reduction, even getting to that point, that's getting extreme. It's you just basically squeezing out all the money, or from the IT team. So I was a few weeks ago, I raised a question on LinkedIn saying, hey, what an acceptable threshold wastage that a company is happy to spend on cloud cost? Is it 5% or 10? I understand having distributed tracing, but there has to be some level of threshold where saying, hey, 2-3% is fine for us to waste, kind of thing. I don't mind it. I'm advocate of it, but that's just going all the way to extreme kind of thing. Some might not like my comment, but
oh yeah, no, I agree. It depends on if you are a massive scale multinational and you really want to make efficient the resources that you have, then it kind of makes sense to me. But if you're a regular organization, based out of New Zealand or Australia, like we work for, it's probably it's effort, it's cost first benefit, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So is there anything that let's use AWS specifically, is there anything they could do to make it easier to manage cost for you as a customer, or any cloud vendor generically, anything they could do to make it easier for us to manage our cost?
The first one would be basically pricing dimensions. It's just so many dimensions, it's just hard to keep track of it. Next one is, again, you've got all these services out there, 200 services. Do we really need them? Now, that's not an onus on the cloud provider. It's more on us as a consumer. We see new shiny thing, we want to use it. Do we really need it? So they're giving us that capability to use it, and we end up using it, and then it costs us. But maybe having some guidelines or helping us saying, these are the use cases when you can use these services. This is what we have seen in the wild, where it works. Don't go implementing AI if you really don't need it, kind of thing. That's a new thing, AI. Everybody's now on the board, starting to implement AI. But do you really need it? Does your business really need it? And that's where having cloud providers come in, even explaining, saying, based on your business, these are things probably you want to use. These are not.
Yeah, so if you've got 200 services, and let's say your organization decides to use 130 of them, and then you look at your pricing and there's like 130 different services you're paying for, and I can imagine it just becomes really complicated to go, how do I make sense of this?
Yeah. Now, if we can't make, as an engineers, we can't make sense. Now imagine finance guys trying to figure out, break it down and trying to understand.
It's a good point. Either you go AWS and you make too many services. No, I'm joking. But like maybe there's a way to bundle it up into, and a more easily digestible.
Yeah. They're trying to do it. Means we do give a lot of stick to the cloud vendors, but they are genuinely trying to help customers because they want to keep the customers, right? I think we were talking about long term. They want to think of long term, making sure they keep the customer for long term rather than having one off, and customers move on to different vendor kind of thing. So they are genuinely trying to make efforts.
My last question is about what organizations can do to keep their cloud costs down, right? And I know we've covered some things already. So we mentioned that if you lift and shift from on-prem into the cloud and you don't sort of design for the cloud, you utilize the dynamic nature of it to spin up and spin down and remove resources and infrastructure as code. Is there anything else you would recommend that organizations do to keep their costs down?
I basically what you call split these things up, keeping costs down into 3 different categories. You've got resource, you've got pricing, and you've got your architecture. Now, I think we've covered a few of these, like, for example, lift and shift is part of the architecture optimization. You want to make sure you're optimizing to leverage the cloud provider's services. Now, let's start with the resource optimization, which is resizing and scaling using the elasticity. That's one thing they can do when it comes to resource. Make sure we've got right size of resource. For example, EC2 instance, if you don't need 6 core, 32 GB EC2 instance, you can work with 4 cores. Maybe that's the right instance type to use. Then you've got scaling, keeping the lights on. As we mentioned, if you don't need to use all the servers, all the resources at night, maybe automate the process to bring those resources down at night and use probably 1 or 2. So that's one area that you can look at in reducing your cost. Another one is when it comes to pricing, you're looking at on demands, probably expensive, looking at reserves instances or even spot instances. If your workload can run at night, can be delayed, probably looking at spot instances why you want to have on demand kind of thing. Right? You're looking at that's your pricing side of things. Cloud providers, they come up with new and better services. For example, storage. Previously, it used to be EBS GP2 storage type. Now they've got GP3, which gives you more flexibility in terms of IOPS you want to use, and it can be cheaper. Like going from, now they've got Graviton instances. That's another one that is a better price model. Why not leverage that? The one that I can think of is vendor agreements. So this is my experience where on-prem vendors had a different pricing agreement versus on cloud, because probably they wanted to keep you using their infrastructure. So you're probably getting better discounts. But moving now your workload into cloud, the license model changes. And then like, hey, you're moving away from our infrastructure into cloud. So looking at that side of things, that's another thing to look at. And that's something which probably as an engineers, we don't have access to. So we might end up spinning a resource which is using more compute than what's required. And suddenly you've got this bill coming in from the vendor saying, hey, you've used our application because you're running, instead of running 4 cores, you're running on 6 cores. Now you need to pay for this 6 cores utilization. Other one that I look at is third-party tools. APM, for example, tools, they hook up into cloud provider infrastructure. Most of them use CloudWatch to get the data. Now, data going out of cloud providers, you are paying for it. And you've got these third-party tools, you're also paying for them. Right? So I want to look at how I can optimize my data ingress cost if I'm using these third-party tools. That's another thing you need to look at. Is it worth going with this third-party tool or using the native tools that cloud providers provide you? Which one is more cost benefit? Yeah, and in terms of architecture, redesigning your application. It's like a funnel that goes horizontally. So right sizing probably will save you immediately, then pricing, but architecture will save you over a long time because you're making sure you've got the right architecture for longer. Because once you resize things, they're working optimally. But as new services come in, you need to re-architect. So you're basically looking at long-term savings if you architect your application correctly. That's what I say. Look at those areas if you're trying to reduce your cloud cost.
A couple of things you mentioned there. One of them is it sounds like if you're an engineer in this space and you're trying to implement FinOps into the way that you think and work, you really need to be aware of all the new services coming on board and the new adaptations of, new modifications of services. So new EC2 instance types, new kinds of storage, which might be more efficient and cheaper. Keeping on top of that seems important to save cost, right? It also sounds like when you decide to adopt the cloud for a service that you already have, that's probably a really good time to not just go to the cloud, but to actually rethink about the value stream that it provides the organization and how you can completely redesign that in a really effective way in the cloud. And probably have lots of other benefits too by simplifying your organizational processes
Yeah.
and not just be thinking about it as a technology problem, but as a chance to improve the business. I think that's all right. Well, we're just about out of time. Is there any final tips or advice that you want to give anyone out there, or anything you want to say in your final moments on this episode?
One of the things is I think we didn't cover is specific metrics to monitor when it comes to cloud cost. Right. There are a few things teams can implement to help understand their cloud cost. One of them is allocation of cloud cost. So what I've noticed in my experience is people might use tagging sometimes not. So you've got this mixture where you can get a breakdown of different resources allocated to different teams, but there are these resources sitting, they're not allocated to anyone. So now you're having trouble. Remember that split that we're talking about? How do you figure out who these resources belong to? Who should be charged back? How does that work? Having that metrics to see over time, you reducing that. So making sure if you've got the right strategy in place, that number or percentage of unallocated cost reduces to zero. Then next one is cost of unused resources versus total cost, which is your cost wastage. So you're looking at cost wastage over total cost of your cloud cost kind of thing. There's another one, which is all these DORA metrics and stuff that people have been talking about. It's mean time to discover, mean time to respond, and mean time to address. There's that. So I look at mean time to address cost. So I break it down into two components. One is costs which might be due to an anomaly. Other one is maybe cost due to your technical debt. For example, we make a conscious decision saying, we're going with this architecture. We know it's sub-optimized in terms of cost. We'll come and fix it. How long does it take you to address that? Is it an year, 2 year, 1 month? That tells you how long you've been spending, basically making a spending cost, extra cost. And then there would be those spikes, which an interesting one, a scenario where we were using CloudWatch and we written a code to send a data, wrote data to Splunk. This was a previous company where Splunk went down. It was hosted on-prem for us. And these Lambda functions that were sending the data just kept on crashing because they couldn't send it. The host wasn't found. And that increased our CloudWatch log cost, right? Because they'll keep on retrying and writing the logs. Right? If we had set up how long it takes us to address that, that's something, probably another thing to look at, those kind of metrics.
That is interesting. A mean time to reduce cost, which makes me think about another thing we didn't cover this time, which was alerting on costs like you would any other kind of monitoring. And if you had the right alerting in place, I guess you could get aware, hey, like you were saying with your own personal sandbox, let's alert if the price goes beyond a certain threshold that we know is unnatural, it's not normal. And
yeah.
and have alerting. You were saying last time as well, and alerting at a sufficient level, at
service level, service API. So if we've got time, basically, that's another example I had is we set up a budget alert for our account level. So this is something I presented at AWS Summit in Thailand, where we'd set up an alert at account level for budget saying, this is what, if it hits this threshold, please alert us. And behind the scene, we were optimizing our applications. So we would optimize SQS, we would optimize DynamoDB. But we didn't think of KMS cost. So what was happening was KMS cost was growing gradually, whereas because we were reducing the cost of other resources, it was never hitting the threshold and alerting us at the account level. And it's when we started breaking it down by, looking at the trends, and that's when we realized, hey, our KMS costs over months been gradually increasing. We need to go and address that. But because we were optimizing others, it would balance it out, and it will never hit that threshold. So then what we did was to add alerts at the service level, and having budget for each service, saying if it goes beyond this based on our trend, please alert us. So that's something.
Thank you so much, Harinder, for coming on the show and talking today about cloud cost. I learned a lot. This is one of those areas I'm exploring at the moment, so it's really awesome to talk to someone who's working in this space. And I know I've seen you posting about it quite a lot over recent years. To me, you're like the cloud cost guy. I don't know how you feel about that.
Probably it's same for me. I've got some my own, that people that I look up to, and I'm like, hey, these other guys are. So yeah, I probably wouldn't say I'm an expert, but yeah, it's an area that I'm interested and curious, and I see value for companies. Something we need to explore and be on top of.
Yeah, so thanks also for having you on the show, and to everyone else, thanks once again for listening in to Slight Reliability, and I will see you all probably next week, if not the week after that.